I should sing that solo to you, or let the green onion do it. I think I was wise in the choice that I made. I have nothing to fear when God is by my side. Those are powerful words from a green onion. Yet, this green onion represents the biblical character Esther, whose story I am going to share with you today. Esther is a 10-chapter book in the Old Testament that follows Nehemiah and precedes Job. The book of Esther takes about 20 minutes to read. The name of God is not mentioned once in the entire story, but God's fingerprints are all over it. It is a story of how God intervenes in the lives of his people through everyday circumstances to bring about his purposes. There are two key points from the book of Esther that I would like to share with you today. First of all, faithfulness and aligning yourself with God brings favor. And secondly, in moments of truth, prayer and obedience brings wisdom and unlocks God's power. If you've never had a chance to read this inspiring little book, I would highly recommend it. It is inspiring for so many reasons. Since I don't have 20 minutes to read the book aloud to you right now, I am going to retell it to you in my own words. This is the 7-minute Anthony version, which you will not find in your Bible app. You are welcome to follow along in your own Bibles. The story of Esther begins with an impulsive, ruthless king named Xerxes, the most powerful man on the planet in the year 460 BC, ruler of the Persian Empire that stretches from modern-day Pakistan to Egypt. He is hosting a 6-month-long party with all of his buddies from the 127 provinces that make up the empire, with roughly 50 million people as citizens. It's an extravagant, spare-no-expense bash that includes an unlimited supply of alcohol. Xerxes is married to the lovely Queen Vashti, and in his potentially very drunken state, the king summons her, essentially to show her off to all of his friends. When Vashti refuses, Xerxes feels humiliated and flies into a rage. The queen is banished from the court to set an example for all women to obey their husbands. The king is then advised to have a beauty pageant by which to select a new queen, one who is better than Vashti. He is delighted with the idea, and 400 of the most beautiful virgins in the land are selected from a field of over 20 million women. A lovely young Jew named Esther is one of the 400. Esther just happens to live in the same city as the capital, Susa. She was adopted by her cousin Mordecai after her parents had died. He has raised her well, taking on the role of father to his orphaned cousin. When Esther is taken into the Persian harem, Mordecai tells her not to reveal her Jewish identity. During the 12 months of beauty treatments, Esther wins the favor of Haggai, the eunuch in charge of the harem. She is given special treatment, her humble and gracious spirit endearing her to everyone. Throughout this time, her cousin Mordecai comes to the court by the harem every day to check up on her. Esther keeps her promise to Mordecai not to reveal her identity as a Jew. When it is Esther's turn to see the king, he becomes smitten with her, and she wins his favor above all the other virgins. Esther is proclaimed the new queen, and Xerxes throws a big empire-wide party. Meanwhile, Mordecai continues to keep tabs on Esther and faithfully comes to the gate outside the courtyard every day. It is during one of these visits that he uncovers a plot to assassinate the king. He reports it to Esther, and she in turn lets King Xerxes know. The two would-be assassins are executed, and Mordecai's service is recorded in the annals of the king. But for some reason, he is not honored at this time. This is where the evil Haman enters the story. He is described as an Agagite, a long-time enemy of the Jews, and he has worked his way up in the system to become Xerxes' second in command. Everyone pays him honor and kneels before him except for Mordecai. And this infuriates Haman, who then goes to the king and manipulates him into signing a decree that will result in the extermination of Mordecai and all of the Jewish people across the empire. Haman does not specifically mention that they are Jews, only that they are people who are not obeying the king's laws. Keep in mind that Xerxes does not know that Esther is a Jew at this point. Mordecai hears about this edict and goes into mourning in sackcloth and ashes and sends words to Esther that she needs to plead with the king for her people. Esther responds that she is not being summoned by Xerxes for 30 days, and to go into the presence of the king on her own will result in almost certain death, according to the law of the kingdom. Mordecai, undaunted, challenges Esther with these words: "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance of the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows, but you have come to royal position for such a time as this." I love Esther's response. She sends word back to Mordecai to gather all of the Jews in Susa together and to fast for her for 3 days and 3 nights, as she and her maids will do likewise. She then says, "When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." Things really take off from here. After the fast, Esther approaches the king, and he extends his gold scepter to her, welcoming her into his presence and promising half the kingdom. She invites him and Haman to a banquet that she is preparing for them that very day, and while feasting, Xerxes asks her again what her request is. She invites the two men to another banquet the following day. That same night, the king is sleepless and asks his attendants to read to him from the king's annals. His attendants turn to the very page that describes Mordecai's uncovering of the assassination plot, an event that took place likely 5 years previously. Since pretty much every event in the daily life of the kingdom is recorded in these annals, I am estimating a book that could well exceed 4,000 pages at that moment. When Xerxes' memory is refreshed with regards to Mordecai, he decides to belatedly honor him. It just so happens that at the very same time, Haman is constructing a 75-foot-high gallows to hang Mordecai on. When Haman shows up the next morning with his intent to make an example of Mordecai, the king commands him instead to plan a parade for him. This marks the beginning of the end for Haman. For it is at the banquet that Esther hosts for Haman and Xerxes that same day when Esther finally reveals her request, identifying the vile Haman as the one responsible for selling her people for destruction and slaughter and annihilation. The king's response was swift, and Haman is hung on his own gallows. Following this, Mordecai is elevated to Haman's previous position as second in command and is commissioned by the king to write a new decree in which the Jews were given the right to assemble, protect, defend, and destroy any armed force that would attack them. This decree was met with great joy by the Jewish people and the city of Susa and set in motion a chain of events that led to an overpowering triumph of the Jews over their enemies and a celebration of their deliverance. That's my retelling of the story of Esther in a nutshell. You can always watch the VeggieTales version, The Girl Who Would Become a slightly different take on the story. What can we learn from the book of Esther? Turns out there's a lot of things we can learn from the book, but I chose two today. And the first one is faithfulness and aligning yourself with God brings favor. One thing you will notice when studying Esther is that she is identified by two different names in the story. She is first introduced by her Jewish name, Hadassah, in chapter 2, verse 7, meaning myrtle tree. It is a bushy plant that has a fragrant, spicy oil used in perfumes. The myrtle tree is always green and has a strong root system that keeps it going even during dire times. I believe we see how the meaning of Esther's Hebrew name is truly prophetic by the manner in which she responds to the trials in her life. As we read further, the author also makes a point of repeating Esther's Jewish background just before it is her turn to go to the king as a virgin, identifying her as the girl Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail. In two other verses in chapter 2, we read that Esther was keeping her family background and nationality secret in compliance with Mordecai's wishes. It is hard to know what was going through Esther's mind at this time, as the text does not say. Considering that she was surrounded by her own maids and hundreds of other girls in the palace harem, it must have been extremely difficult for her to keep her Jewish identity a secret. The fact that she does says a lot about her character and the trust and respect she must have developed in her relationship with her adoptive father, Mordecai, to whom her faithfulness and obedience is unwavering. Esther could easily have given sway to the luxury and ease of life in the Persian court, or become prideful in her new privileged status. But she remembered her roots and her commitment to her faith and family. What is abundantly clear is that God's favor is resting upon Esther throughout the time leading up to her coronation as Queen of Persia. Chapter 2, verse 9 says that Esther won the favor of Haggai, who was in charge of the harem. In fact, it is stated that he immediately provided her with beauty treatments and special food. Chapter 2, verse 15 says that Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. Finally, in 2:17, after Esther was taken to see King Xerxes, she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. Perhaps it would be appropriate at this time to define favor. A dictionary definition would say that to favor someone would be to give special regard to treat with goodwill, or to show exceptional kindness to someone. It is generally used in a comparative way towards others. God's favor goes beyond this. It means that the one favored is shown kindness and treated with a generosity and goodwill that is far beyond what is normally expected. We are treated much better than we could expect. So what is it about Esther that gave her such favored status? Was it her physical appearance? Remember, she is first described as being lovely in form and features. If that were the case, then all of the other virgins would be favored as well, as they had all made the cut to harem status. No, I believe it is a matter of Esther's heart and attitude. Esther's faithfulness and obedience to her adoptive father, Mordecai, her self-control in keeping her Jewish identity a secret, and her humility in following the advice of Haggai and Mordecai speak to a heart that is aligned with God's. The other thing I would like to say about favor is that it should not be associated with ease of circumstances. Having God's favor upon us does not mean that our lives will be smooth sailing and devoid of problems or conflicts and tragedy. Check out the life of Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his jealous brothers, then tossed into an Egyptian prison after showing incredible restraint and responsibility as the manager of his master Potiphar's house, only to be unjustly accused of molesting Potiphar's wife, who tried to seduce him. Let's read from Genesis chapter 39, verses 20 to 23 to see what happens next. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. What did Esther and Joseph have in common? That God's favor was bestowed upon them. I think the answer lies in the first 4 verses of the 3rd chapter in the book of Proverbs. My son, do not forget my teaching, but keep my commands in your heart, for they will prolong your life many years and bring you prosperity. Let love and faithfulness never leave you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart. Then you will win favor and a good name in the sight of God and man. Those of you that know me well will know that I have experienced some significant life-changing circumstances in my own life. In fact, one of the reasons that I identify so strongly with the story of Esther is that she finds herself placed in circumstances that are completely beyond her control. I can't imagine that Esther was happy about being taken from her home and placed into a harem, away from family and friends and the security of her Jewish community. Neither is it conceivable that she had aspirations to one day become Queen of Persia, wife to an impulsive, ruthless, and ungodly ruler. Yet she remained steadfast and faithful despite being swept up in this tidal wave of events. Over the past few years, I have personally experienced the feeling of being swept along in circumstances beyond my control, and have gone through some incredibly painful times where I have felt crushed, overwhelmed, despondent, and very unfairly treated. At times I have cried out to God, "Why me, Lord? What did I do to deserve this?" I felt that things were happening to me that were out of my control, events that brought a feeling of loss and despair. I'm not going to share my whole story here, but I will tell you about one particular situation that is a recent development. Just over a year ago, I was transferred from my position as principal of a school where I had been firmly established for 5 years to the same position at a different school across town. It was not a transfer that I requested or desired. In fact, I was devastated at having to leave a school that I loved, where so much good had been accomplished and where I was surrounded by a wonderful team of people. It took me months to get over the shock and disappointment of this, especially when confronted with some profound challenges in my new surroundings. I decided to trust God with it all and continue to be faithful to put my heart and soul into my new surroundings, but wow, was it ever excruciatingly tough at times. The exciting thing, though, is that through this experience, I have come to personally know God's favor upon my leadership at my new school. How many times this year have events transpired where my wife Jasmine and I have said, "Hey, that's a God thing." One instance in particular was the provision of a vice principal from the school board office, an appointment that came virtually out of the blue. And it was at a time when I was literally on the verge of exhaustion. In a particularly difficult time, I was given a gift. I recognized it instantly as a gift from God, His favor upon me. Despite the amount of unfaithfulness that we see splashed all over the covers of magazines at the checkout stand, I believe that faithfulness is a quality that is still highly esteemed in our culture. By definition, faithfulness is the concept of unfailingly remaining loyal to someone or something and putting that loyalty into consistent practice, regardless of extenuating circumstances. Just listen to the applause anytime you hear that a couple has celebrated an anniversary, or the accolades for a hockey player who displays loyalty to his team by honoring the terms of his contract, even if that team has never and perhaps will never win a Stanley Cup. These are examples of faithfulness that are celebrated in our culture. It is a godly quality, a fruit of the Spirit, one that is very difficult to achieve without God's help. I think this is just the kind of thing that God loves for us to ask for. What a great idea to examine our lives for character traits we desire and say, Lord, help me today to be faithful to you, to stand firm when I am tempted to gossip or when I get discouraged by what's going on around me. Simple, honest prayers that will open the door for God to build a foundation of great character in you. Esther remembered her Jewish identity and stayed true to her family and her faith in God. Something else about the myrtle tree here. Even when it is cut down to a stump, its roots cause it to sprout again. I think faithfulness is like that myrtle tree. When we practice it and live it, we will grow roots that will help us to withstand the most trying times, and that, like the tree, we will grow and flourish. I believe that God's favor is not excluded for the privileged few, but is available to all who are faithful and seek Him wholeheartedly. Ultimately, when Esther really steps out on a limb, seeking God through fasting and obeying Him despite her fears, we see God coming through for her, for Mordecai, and for his people in an absolutely remarkable turn of events. We see how God loves to use His children to bring about His purposes. That brings me to my second point. In moments of truth, prayer and obedience brings wisdom and unlocks God's power. Let's go back to chapter 4, Esther's moment of truth. You may recall that at this point in the story, Mordecai had sent word to Esther about Haman's edict against the Jews. Chapter 4, verse 8 says that he urged her to go into the king's presence, to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Here is Esther's response. All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that he be put to death. The only exception to this is for the king to extend his gold scepter to him and spare his life. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. The text does not specifically say that Esther was afraid, but it doesn't take much to assume that she was likely terrified at this prospect. Keep in mind, Esther had always followed Mordecai's instructions in the past. She doesn't actually say no to him, but perhaps she feels the need to underscore the immensity of his request and the likely consequences of it for her. Regardless, Mordecai is undeterred and challenges Esther to not remain silent. It is interesting that up until this point, he has instructed her to keep silent, but now is the time to speak out. And who knows that you have come to royal position for such a time as this. Esther requires no more prompting. She trusts Mordecai. I think she realizes that this is her moment of truth. It is time to stand up and be counted. Gulp. You can literally feel her heart pounding like a hammer through the page. And it is at this moment that she makes the best decision of her entire life. She asks for prayer. Not just any prayer. This is an urgent, all-out seeking of God. A 3-day and 3-night fast that will involve the entire Jewish community. Clearly, Esther is not seeking God to ask her to relieve her from the task before her either, as is evident in her words to Mordecai. When the fast is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Esther realizes that she cannot do this thing on her own strength. In fact, this is not really about her anymore. It's about being a vessel for God to use. It doesn't matter what happens to me. It's about trusting God to give me the courage and wisdom needed to rise up and do what must be done. I think that there is great encouragement and inspiration to be taken from the example of Esther's decision here. It has been my own experience that there are frequently defining moments for me along the way, as I suspect is the case for each of us. These are moments that require something more of us. Moments where we may be required to go way out of our comfort zone, to speak out, or to make a choice that goes against the grain of society or our own friends or colleagues, and may potentially lead to rejection or persecution in one form or another. John Eldredge, author of Wild at Heart, speaks to our human-like tendencies at this point. He writes, "Most of us have been misinterpreting life and what God is doing for a long time. I think I'm just trying to get God to make my life work easier," said a client of mine. "We're asking the wrong questions," he continues. "Most of us are asking, God, why did you let this happen to me? Or God, why don't you just fill in the blank? Help me succeed, or get my kids to straighten out, or fix my marriage. You know what you've been whining about." But to enter into a journey of initiation with God requires a new set of questions. Lord, what are you trying to teach me here? What issues in my heart are you trying to raise through this? Or, Lord, what is it you want me to see? What are you asking me to let go of? Notice that these are all questions that are taking the spotlight away from our own fears and needs and focusing on God's plan. When we pray this way, it opens the door for God to do some pretty incredible stuff in our lives. Earlier this year, I was facing a situation that was extremely stressful, involving some individuals that had brought a lot of fear and anxiety into my school. I could feel the heavy burden of responsibility in having to deal with this situation. I knew that I was going to have to take action and confront the individuals, but I was afraid. I could feel the icy fingers of fear gripping my heart. I remember seeking God and praying for wisdom on how to proceed, and asking the members of our home group to pray as well. Ultimately, I called a meeting that involved both the people who were doing the threatening and creating the anxiety, as well as the staff who were being affected. The thing I remember the most about that meeting was an incredible sense of the presence of God in our midst. As I led the meeting, I felt emboldened and inspired, and was given wisdom and words that I had not planned in advance. The end result was a complete transformation in the relationship between this family and the school staff, a peaceful resolution, and the beginning of a foundation of trust and working together towards a common goal. An incredible answer to prayer. Jesus, in his Sermon on the Mount, says to his disciples, "Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks the door will be opened." What an incredible promise. We see in the book of Esther what can happen when real, authentic asking, seeking, and knocking takes place. In fact, one could look at the events following her and her people's 3 days of fasting and identify two specific results of it. The first one, God gave Esther humility, which gave her a posture of wisdom and grace. Notice what happens when Esther approaches the king in chapter 5, verse 1. It says that she dressed in her royal robes and took up a position in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's throne room. Esther did not rush into King Xerxes and demand an audience. She humbly and discreetly presented herself in a way that prompted the king to notice her. And it says that he was pleased to see her. From there, the king extended his gold scepter and opened the door for Esther to make her petition. I believe that the Holy Spirit was on Esther at this point, and the favors that were upon her previously are now increased by tenfold from having immersed herself in the presence of God. Instead of laying out her request then and there, she instead invites the king and Haman to a banquet that very day. Even at the banquet, Esther restrained herself from pouring out her petition, inviting the two men to a second banquet on the following day. This proved to be an incredibly wise strategy, as it was that very night that King Xerxes suffered from insomnia and was reminded about the life-saving actions of Mordecai. Timing was everything. The second result of her fast was that God disturbed those in power and moved them to action. When the king was reminded of what Mordecai had done for him, he immediately set out to rectify the situation. And in an ironic twist of fate that can only be attributed to God's providence, uses the evil Haman as the author of Mordecai's honor. Then, at Esther's second banquet, the time is now ripe for Xerxes to learn what is really going on. With Mordecai's heroic actions fresh in his memory, he is now perfectly disposed to hear the truth of Haman's despicable plan. Esther now tells him everything, but even the way in which she does shows tremendous insight. The words of her request, skillfully and humbly stated in chapter 7, verses 3 and 4. If I have found favor with you, O king, and if it pleases your majesty, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold for destruction and slaughter and annihilation. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet because no such request would justify disturbing the king. The book of Proverbs has a few things to say about kings that are truly borne out in the story of Esther. Proverbs 19 verse 12 says that a king's rage is like the roar of a lion, but his favor is like dew on the grass. Proverbs 22:11 says, he who loves a pure heart and whose speech is gracious will have the king for his friend. Finally, in Proverbs 21:1 we read, the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. He directs it like a watercourse wherever he pleases. So, if there are any doubts about what God is capable of doing, lay them to rest. Xerxes, one of the most feared rulers in history and the most powerful man of his time, is now an agent of righteousness and deliverance for Esther, Mordecai, and the entire Jewish race. Talk about a turnaround. This is clearly God's doing. And it all comes about through Esther and Mordecai's faithfulness, obedience, and humbling themselves before God in prayer. You already know the rest of the story, how Haman is executed, Mordecai elevated, and the Jewish people delivered. You know what's really exciting to me? We serve the same God today as the one who intervened in such a remarkable way in the lives of his people in the story of Esther. In 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 14, the Lord appears to Solomon at the completion of the building of the temple and shares these words with him. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. I want to encourage each of you to take these words to heart and to truly seek God's face in the midst of your own journeys. The time to pray is always there, every moment of the day, as God is just as interested in your sentence prayers as much as he is the lengthier ones. However, there are other opportunities to pray with fellow believers. Here at Summit Church, there's a corporate prayer every Wednesday night over the summer. a great time to seek God together as a church family with fellow believers. I know I heard it announced earlier that it goes from 7 to 8:15, and I happened to read the schedule in the foyer before the service this morning. This week's focus is Psalm 86, and prayer will be for church staff. Did you know that there's a National House of Prayer in Ottawa, whose mandate is informed strategic prayer for Canada and its leaders? Churches can bring a prayer team to Ottawa any time of the year for a week at a time to receive training and teaching and to specifically pray for our government and our leaders. If you stop and think about what God did in the kingdom of Persia with a government that was run by the worst kind of leadership, don't you think he can do wonders in our country right now? We are being called to prayer. The book of Esther is a true treasure. It reminds us that faithfulness and aligning yourself with God brings favor, and that in moments of truth, prayer and obedience brings wisdom and unlocks God's power. My prayer for you is that you will draw inspiration from Esther's story and make your own story one of faithful submission to God. May we each face our own moments of truth as Esther did, with faithful hearts, humble spirits, and a life of prayer.